Or, if it is true, that in order to fly on the Earth's surface, to keep oneself suspended in the air, merely by the play of the muscles, there requires a strength 150 times greater than that which we possess, a simple act of volition, a caprice, would bear us into space, if attraction did not exist? Just so, said Nicole, smiling. If we could succeed in suppressing weight, as they suppress pain by anesthesia, that would change the face of modern society. Yes, cried Michel, full of his subject, destroy weight, and no more burdens. Well said, replied Barbicane, but if nothing had any weight, nothing would keep in its place, not even your hat on your head, worthy Michel, nor your house, whose stones only adhere by weight, nor a boat, whose stability on the waves is only caused by weight, not even the ocean, whose waves would no longer be equalized by terrestrial attraction, and lastly, not even the atmosphere, whose atoms, being no longer held in their places, would disperse in space. That is tiresome, retorted Michel, nothing like these matter-of-fact people, for bringing one back to the bare reality. But console yourself, Michel, continued Barbicane, for if no orb exists from whence all laws of weight are banished, you are at least going to visit one, where it is much less than on the earth. The moon? Yes, the moon, on whose surface objects weigh 6 times less than on the earth, a phenomenon easy to prove. And we shall feel it, asked Michel. Evidently, as 200 pounds will only weigh 30 pounds on the surface of the moon, and our muscular strength will not diminish. Not at all. Instead of jumping 1 yard high, you will rise 18 feet high. But we shall be regular Herculeses in the moon? Exclaimed Michel. Yes, replied Nicole, for if the height of the Selenites is in proportion to the density of their globe, they will be scarcely a foot high. Lilliputians, ejaculated Michel, I shall play the part of Gulliver. We are going to realize the fable of the giants. This is the advantage of leaving one's own planet and overrunning the solar world. One moment, Michel, answered Barbicane. If you wish to play the part of Gulliver, only visit the inferior planets, such as Mercury, Venus, or Mars, whose density is a little less than that of the Earth. But do not venture into the great planets Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, for there the order will be changed, and you will become Lilliputian. And in the sun, if its density is 1,324,000 times greater, and the attraction is 27 times greater than on the surface of our globe, keeping everything in proportion, the inhabitants ought to be at least 200 feet high. By Jove, exclaimed Michel, I should be nothing more than a pygmy, a shrimp. Gulliver with the giants, said Nicole. Just so, replied Barbicane. And it would not be quite useless to carry some pieces of artillery to defend oneself? Good, replied Nicole, your projectiles would have no effect on the sun. They would fall back upon the earth after some minutes. That is a strong remark. It is certain, replied Barbicane. The attraction is so great on this enormous orb that an object weighing 70,000 pounds on the earth would weigh but 1,920 pounds on the surface of the sun. If you were to fall upon it, you would weigh, let me see, about 5,000 pounds, a weight which you would never be able to raise again. The devil, said Michel, one would want a portable crane. However, we will be satisfied with the moon for the present. There at least we shall cut a great figure. We will see about the sun by and by. Chapter 9. The consequences of a deviation. Barbicane had now no fear of the issue of the journey, at least as far as the projectile's impulsive force was concerned. Its own speed would carry it beyond the neutral line. It would certainly not return to Earth. It would certainly not remain motionless on the line of attraction. One single hypothesis remained to be realized: the arrival of the projectile at its destination by the action of the lunar attraction. It was in reality a fall of 8,296 leagues on an orb, it is true, where weight could only be reckoned at 1/6 of terrestrial weight. A formidable fall, nevertheless, and one against which every precaution must be taken without delay. These precautions were of two sorts: some to deaden the shock when the projectile should touch the lunar soil, others to delay the fall and consequently make it less violent. To deaden the shock, it was a pity that Barbicane was no longer able to employ the means which had so ably weakened the shock at departure, that is to say, by water used as springs and the partition breaks. The partitions still existed, but water failed, for they could not use their reserve, which was precious in case during the first days the liquid element should be found wanting on lunar soil. And indeed this reserve would have been quite insufficient for a spring. The layer of water stored in the projectile at the time of starting upon their journey occupied no less than 3 feet in depth and spread over a surface of not less than 54 square feet. Besides, the cistern did not contain 1/5 part of it. They must therefore give up this efficient means of deadening the shock of arrival. Happily, Barbicane, not content with employing water, had furnished the movable disc with strong spring plugs, destined to lessen the shock against the base. After the breaking of the horizontal partitions, these plugs still existed. They had only to readjust them and replace the movable disc. Every piece easy to handle, as their weight was now scarcely felt, was quickly mounted. The different pieces were fitted without trouble, it being only a matter of bolts and screws. Tools were not wanting, and soon the reinstated disc lay on steel plugs, like a table on its legs. One inconvenience resulted from the replacing of the disc: the lower window was blocked up. Thus it was impossible for the travelers to observe the moon from that opening, while they were being precipitated perpendicularly upon her. But they were obliged to give it up, even by the side openings. They could still see vast lunar regions, as an aeronaut sees the Earth from his car. This replacing of the disc was at least an hour's work. It was past 12. When all preparations were finished, Barbicane took fresh observations on the inclination of the projectile, but to his annoyance, it had not turned over sufficiently for its fall. It seemed to take a curve parallel to the lunar disc. The orb of night shone splendidly into space, while opposite, the orb of day blazed with fire. Their situation began to make them uneasy. "Are we reaching our destination?" said Nicholl. "Let us act as if we were about reaching it," replied Barbicane. "You are skeptical," retorted Michel Ardan. "We shall arrive, and that, too, quicker than we like." This answer brought Barbicane back to his preparations, and he occupied himself with placing the contrivances intended to break their descent. We may remember the scene of the meeting held at Tampa Town, in Florida, when Captain Nicholl came forward as Barbicane's enemy and Michel Ardan's adversary, to Captain Nicholl's maintaining that the projectile would smash like glass. Michel replied that he would break their fall by means of rockets properly placed. Thus, powerful fireworks, taking their starting point from the base and bursting outside, could, by producing a recoil, check to a certain degree the projectile's speed. These rockets were to burn in space, it is true. But oxygen would not fail them, for they could supply themselves with it, like the lunar volcanoes, the burning of which has never yet been stopped by the want of atmosphere round the moon. Barbicane had accordingly supplied himself with these fireworks, enclosed in little steel guns, which could be screwed onto the base of the projectile. Inside, these guns were flush with the bottom. Outside, they protruded about 18 inches. There were 20 of them. An opening left in the disc allowed them to light the match, with which each was provided. All the effect was felt outside. The burning mixture had already been rammed into each gun. They had then nothing to do but raise the metallic buffers fixed in the base and replace them by the guns, which fitted closely in their places. This new work was finished about 3 o'clock, and after taking all these precautions, there remained but to wait, but the projectile was perceptibly nearing the moon, and evidently succumbed to her influence to a certain degree. Though its own velocity also drew it in an oblique direction, from these conflicting influences resulted a line, which might become a tangent, but it was certain that the projectile would not fall directly on the moon, for its lower part, by reason of its weight, ought to be turned toward her. Barbicane's uneasiness increased, as he saw his projectile resist the influence of gravitation. The unknown was opening before him, the unknown in interplanetary space. The man of science thought he had foreseen the only 3 hypotheses possible: return to the Earth, the return to the moon, or stagnation on the neutral line. And here a 4th hypothesis, big with all the terrors of the infinite, surged up inopportunely. To face it without flinching, one must be a resolute savant like Barbicane, a phlegmatic being like Nicole, or an audacious adventurer like Michel Ardan. Conversation was started upon this subject. Other men would have considered the question from a practical point of view. They would have asked themselves whether their projectile carriage was carrying them. Not so with these. They sought for the cause which produced this effect. So we have become diverted from our route, said Michel. But why? I very much fear, answered Nicole, that, in spite of all precautions taken, the Columbiad was not fairly pointed. An error, however small, would be enough to throw us out of the moon's attraction. Then they must have aimed badly, asked Michel. I do not think so, replied Barbicane. The perpendicularity of the gun was exact, its direction to the zenith of the spot incontestable, and the moon passing to the zenith of the spot, we ought to reach it at the full. There is another reason, but it escapes me. Are we not arriving too late? Asked Nicole. Too late, said Barbicane. Yes, continued Nicole. The Cambridge Observatory's note says that the transit ought to be accomplished in 97 hours, 13 minutes and 20 seconds, which means to say that sooner the moon will not be at the point indicated, and later it will have passed it. True, replied Barbicane, but we started the 1st of December at 13 minutes and 25 seconds to 11 at night. And we ought to arrive on the 5th at midnight, at the exact moment when the moon would be full. And we are now at the 5th of December. It is now 3:30 in the evening. 8:30 ought to see us at the end of our journey. Why do we not arrive? Might it not be an excess of speed? Answered Nicole, for we know now that its initial velocity was greater than they supposed. No, 100 times, no, replied Barbicane. An excess of speed, if the direction of the projectile had been right, would not have prevented us reaching the moon. No, there has been a deviation. We have been turned out of our course. By whom? By what? Asked Nicholl. I cannot say, replied Barbicane. Very well, then, Barbicane, said Michel. Do you wish to know my opinion on the subject of finding out this deviation? Speak. I would not give $50 to know it. That we have deviated is a fact. Where we are going matters little. We shall soon see. Since we are being borne along in space, we shall end by falling into some center of attraction or other. Michel Ardan's indifference did not content Barbicane, not that he was uneasy about the future, but he wanted to know at any cost why his projectile had deviated. But the projectile continued its course sideways to the moon, and with it the mass of things thrown out. Barbicane could even prove, by the elevations, which served as landmarks upon the moon, which was only 2,000 leagues distant, that its speed was becoming uniform. Fresh proof that there was no fall. Its impulsive force still prevailed over the lunar attraction. But the projectile's course was certainly bringing it nearer to the moon, and they might hope that at a nearer point the weight predominating would cause a decided fall. The three friends, having nothing better to do, continued their observations, but they could not yet determine the topographical position of the satellite. Every relief was leveled under the reflection of the solar rays. They watched thus through the side windows until 8 o'clock at night. The moon had grown so large in their eyes that it filled half of the firmament. The sun on one side, and the orb of night on the other, flooded the projectile with light. At that moment Barbicane thought he could estimate the distance which separated them from their aim at no more than 700 leagues. The speed of the projectile seemed to him to be more than 200 yards, or about 170 leagues a second. Under the centripetal force, the base of the projectile tended toward the moon. But the centrifugal still prevailed, and it was probable that its rectilineal course would be changed to a curve of some sort, the nature of which they could not at present determine. Barbicane was still seeking the solution of his insoluble problem. Hours passed without any result. The projectile was evidently nearing the moon, but it was also evident that it would never reach her. As to the nearest distance at which it would pass her, that must be the result of two forces, attraction and repulsion, affecting its motion. I ask but one thing, said Michel, that we may pass near enough to penetrate her secrets. Cursed be the thing that has caused our projectile to deviate from its course, cried Nicholl. And, as if a light had suddenly broken in upon his mind, Barbicane answered, Then cursed be the meteor which crossed our path. What? Said Michel Ardan. What do you mean? Exclaimed Nicholl. I mean, said Barbicane in a decided tone, I mean that our deviation is owing solely to our meeting with this erring body. But it did not even brush us as it passed, said Michel. What does that matter? Its mass, compared to that of our projectile, was enormous, and its attraction was enough to influence our course. So little, cried Nicholl. Yes, Nicholl, but however little it might be, replied Barbicane, in a distance of 84,000 leagues, it wanted no more to make us miss the moon. Chapter 10. The observers OFTHEMOON. Barbicane had evidently hit upon the only plausible reason of this deviation. However slight it might have been, it had sufficed to modify the course of the projectile. It was a fatality. the bold attempt had miscarried by a fortuitous circumstance, and unless by some exceptional event they could now never reach the moon's disk, would they pass near enough to be able to solve certain physical and geological questions, until then insoluble? This was the question, and the only one, which occupied the minds of these bold travelers. As to the fate in store for themselves, they did not even dream of it. But what would become of them, amid these infinite solitudes, these who would soon want air? A few more days, and they would fall stifled in this wandering projectile, but some days to these intrepid fellows was a century, and they devoted all their time to observe that moon, which they no longer hoped to reach. The distance which had then separated the projectile from the satellite was estimated at about 200 leagues. Under these conditions, as regards the visibility of the details of the disk, the travelers were farther from the moon than are the inhabitants of Earth with their powerful telescopes. Indeed, we know that the instrument mounted by Lord Rosse at Parsonstown, which magnifies 6,500 times, brings the moon to within an apparent distance of 16 leagues, and more than that with the powerful one set up at Long's Peak. The orb of night, magnified 48,000 times, is brought to within less than 2 leagues, and objects having a diameter of 30 feet are seen very distinctly, so that, at this distance, the topographical details of the moon, observed without glasses, could not be determined with precision. The eye caught the vast outline of those immense depressions inappropriately called seas, but they could not recognize their nature. The prominence of the mountains disappeared under the splendid irradiation produced by the reflection of the solar rays. The eye, dazzled as if it was leaning over a bath of molten silver, turned from it involuntarily. But the oblong form of the orb was quite clear. It appeared like a gigantic egg, with the small end turned toward the earth. Indeed, the moon, liquid and pliable in the first days of its formation, was originally a perfect sphere. But being soon drawn within the attraction of the earth, it became elongated under the influence of gravitation. In becoming a satellite, she lost her native purity of form. Her center of gravity was in advance of the center of her figure, and from this fact, some savants draw the conclusion that the air and water had taken refuge on the opposite surface of the moon, which is never seen from the earth. This alteration in the primitive form of the satellite was only perceptible for a few moments. The distance of the projectile from the moon diminished very rapidly under its speed, though that was much less than its initial velocity, but 8 or 9 times greater than that which propels our express trains. The oblique course of the projectile, from its very obliquity, gave Michel Ardan some hopes of striking the lunar disk at some point or other. He could not think that they would never reach it. No, he could not believe it, and this opinion he often repeated, but Barbicane, who was a better judge, always answered him with merciless logic. No, Michel, no, we can only reach the moon by a fall, and we are not falling. The centripetal force keeps us under the moon's influence, but the centrifugal force draws us irresistibly away from it. This was said in a tone which quenched Michel Ardan's last hope. The portion of the moon which the projectile was nearing was the northern hemisphere, that which the selenographic maps place below. For these maps are generally drawn after the outline given by the glasses, and we know that they reverse the objects. Such was the Mappa Selenographica of Barr and Moedler, which Barbicane consulted. This northern hemisphere presented vast plains, dotted with isolated mountains. At midnight the moon was full. At that precise moment, the travelers should have alighted upon it if the mischievous meteor had not diverted their course. The orb was exactly in the condition determined by the Cambridge Observatory. It was mathematically at its perigee, and at the zenith of the 28th parallel. An observer placed at the bottom of the enormous Columbiad, pointed perpendicularly to the horizon, would have framed the moon in the mouth of the gun. A straight line drawn through the axis of the piece would have passed through the center of the orb of night. It is needless to say that during the night of the 5th-6th of December, the travelers took not an instant's rest, could they close their eyes, when so near this new world? No, all their feelings were concentrated in one single thought. See, representatives of the earth, of humanity, past and present, all centered in them. It is through their eyes that the human race look at these lunar regions and penetrate the secrets of their satellite. A strange emotion filled their hearts as they went from one window to the other. Their observations, reproduced by Barbicane, were rigidly determined to take them. They had glasses to correct them, maps. As regards the optical instruments at their disposal, they had excellent marine glasses, specially constructed for this journey. They possessed magnifying powers of 100. They would thus have brought the moon to within a distance apparent of less than 2,000 leagues from the earth, but then, at a distance, which for 3 hours in the morning, did not exceed 65 miles, and in a medium free from all atmospheric disturbances. These instruments could reduce the lunar surface to within less than 1,500 yards.